I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Gerald France of Caledonia, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, Jerry, can you start us off with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Sure. Thanks, Jim. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I was born in 1925 in New York City. And when I was born, my father left the home and left his wife and 2 children. And for a year and a half, we struggled in New York City, my mother working as a waitress in Charles' restaurant. Sergeant Keogh on Governor's Island learned about our condition and invited us to come and spend a weekend with him on Governor's Island. My brother Tom and I went over there, and the weekend stretched into 16 years. We never left there until we enlisted in the Army in World War II.
Right.
Governor's Island was a wonderful place to live. It was really an Eden. It's in the shadow of Manhattan, high-rise buildings. But it was a pleasant place. It had MPs guarding 24 hours a day, every inch of the island. The prisoners swept all the streets under guard. They had shotguns, but they swept. Prisoners were not dangerous. They were mostly AWOL soldiers.
Okay, so it was a military prison that was there.
Yes. Governor's Island was Fort Che, Governor's Island.
Okay.
It was home of the 16th Infantry.
Mm-hmm.
16th Infantry had quite a reputation. 16th, and my stepfather, I will call him, although he wasn't relative, Sergeant Keogh, he enlisted when he was 15 years old in the 16th Infantry to go into the Spanish-American War with General Arthur MacArthur, who was Douglas MacArthur's father. And this was Douglas Arthur MacArthur, Jr. And they did the Spanish-American War and went from there into the Philippines. Went into the Philippines twice. Then they chased Pancho Villa through Mexico. They got into World War I, and the 16th was the first to take casualties in World War I.
And they were by then part of the 1st Infantry Division as well.
16th Infantry, yes. Yep. And they also received the Croix de Guerre from France twice, and were in every event of World War I. So after World War I, Sergeant Keogh came back to Governor's Island with the 16th Infantry, and he retired in 1925. And that happened to be the year I was born. He had never married. He was a dutiful soldier. So he got married to an old acquaintance and had us come and live with him for first a weekend and then for 16 years. Okay. It was a great place to be. We had golf courts and tennis courts, and we had a post school that was supplied by New York City school teachers, and all of the kids there were so imbued in Army life that it was just assumed that we would be 16th Infantry members. We had a Boy Scout troop that was a mounted troop, the only mounted Boy Scout troop in America. We had a shoulder patch with a horse's head on it. The horses, however, were polo ponies because we had polo matches every Sunday by the officers on the post. So they were kind of frisky. But other than that, if we wanted to go to camping or if we wanted to go to Dan Beard's memorial out in Oyster Bay, Long Island, the Army always took drivers and trucks and took us where we wanted to go. All right. It's quite a life.
Now you had supplied us with kind of a short written memoir as well. Now, did you get over to the island where the Statue of Liberty is?
Yes, we did. Because our school also served Statue of Liberty. We had a little post over there, Fort Wood. And Fort Wood had 5 or 6 kids. And the general had a launch at Fort Che. And every day the launch would go over and pick up these kids, bring them back to Governor's Island for school. And sometimes we'd go back with them to the Statue of Liberty. At that time, the arm was open, and we would see who could race up fastest up into the arm of the statue. And they cut that out permanently when they saw cracks developing in the arm of the statue.
All right, so you were a little bit too rough for the Statue of Liberty then.
Too heavy, I guess.
Something. All right.
But from there, you know, you could look out from the crown, had windows in it, and you had quite a view of the harbor from up there.
Okay. Now, did the school on Governor's Island include a high school, or did you have to go someplace else for that?
We had to go someplace else. I went through 8th grade. And the graduating class, my brother graduated a year before me, but he had only 3 kids in his class, so that was not enough to make an event out of it. So he went off to high school and he came back and he graduated again with us, and altogether we had 10 kids in the graduating class. Wasn't a big school, but it was a good school, a lot of fun. Then we went to high school, most of us went to the same place, to Staten Island, Curtis High School, which meant that you had to take your ferry from Governor's Island over, and I've got a picture here of the ferry, if you wanted to see what that looked like. That's a picture of my crew. I'll show you that later. This is a picture of the Governor's Island ferry. It goes across to Manhattan. And we had a dock over there, and right next to the Governor's Island ferry dock, Staten Island ferry. So we had to go over there, and for a nickel, you got to ride for a half hour to Staten Island.
So how long did it take you to get to school then?
Well, it was long enough to get your homework done.
I guess so. All right. Now, you're still in high school when Pearl Harbor happens. Do you remember how you heard about that?
Yes. We were, all the kids had a clubhouse, all the boys had a clubhouse down in the basement of the post chapel, St. Cornelius the Centurion. And the chaplain had given us to us when they stopped using coal. We got it cleaned out and painted, and so we had a nice clubhouse. So we were down there having a party for my brother's 18th birthday, which was on December 7th, 1941. And during the party, we had the radio on, and they announced that Pearl Harbor had been attacked by the Japanese. It was quite a surprise, but of course all of the boys figured that they were going to go before they finished high school and got to college or anything else. So the next day, they all went down to enlist in the Army. My brother went into the Aviation Cadets of the United States Army Air Corps. And I was only 16 and a half, so I was kind of left out, the runt.
All right. Now, before Pearl Harbor happened, how aware were you of what was happening in the rest of the world? There was a war going on in Europe. There was trouble in China.
Oh, yes. I was, during my high school years, I spent my summers working in the Post Exchange. And as a member of the Post Exchange staff, in the summer times when they had maneuvers for the 16th Infantry, the whole 1st Division maneuvered together, 16th, 18th, and 26th Infantry. And 2 other guys and myself from the Post Exchange went with the maneuver troops, and we set up a Post Exchange there where we served beer and Coke, soda pop, and cigarettes and stuff like that. They all did their maneuvers during the daytime, and then they'd come and have a party with us. And that lasted for maybe 3 or 4 weeks every summer. So we were pretty imbued in infantry. There was no other place to go.
Well,
I wouldn't say that everybody was unsurprised by Japan's attack, but I thought that there was more feeling that the war was coming, and that's why we're beefing up our maneuvers. The war was coming because of unrest in Russia. But as it turned out, Russia became an ally during the war, not an enemy at all. But the big maneuvers were in Louisiana in 1941, and that was in the summertime, where divisions from all over the country gathered there to do. So that's as close as we got to the Army, but we were ready for it. We did a lot of, as Boy Scouts, we did rifle practice on the regular Army rifle ranges, and we watched and were instructed in machine gun operation and firing, although they didn't let us do any of the firing itself.
Now,
So we were ready for it.
Okay. Were you learning about the old, like water-cooled things with the big round tubes, or were they just the regular machine gun?
Regular machine gun.
Okay. Because there's the old World War I variety, and they still had some of those later.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you're only 16 when the war starts. So when and how did you wind up getting into the service?
I was, when I was 17 and a half, I waited a year, and I had a job in the meantime. Went to high school as well. But when I was 17 and a half, I enlisted in the aviation cadets. And you could do that. Remember that in those days, and it may still be true, that I could have gotten into the Navy or the Marines at 17, but you can't get into the 18 in the Army. So I said, well, I'll go in. Everybody else was gone. I'm going to go in the Navy. But you had to have permission of your parents, and they wouldn't give me permission. So by the time I was 17 and a half, I took my exams with the aviation cadets, and I was sworn in at 17 and a half, but I couldn't serve until 18.
Okay. Now, can you explain what the aviation cadet program was?
Yes, I had to go through regular basic training, Army basic training, and then I was sent to, or we were all sent to college training detachment, and I went to St. Cloud, Minnesota State Teachers for that. And then there they gave us specialized classes like in astronomy, so we'd know how to find our way out of jungles and things. So we spent 10 weeks there, and then went from there to classification and pre-flight. In classification, you go through a battery of tests to find out what your skills are. You have eye-hand coordination, with posts down there, you got to line up. And I had passed equally, so I had a choice of going into pilot training, navigation, or bombardiering. Well, what red-blooded American boy is going to do anything but go to pilot school?
Okay. Now, where did you do the classification?
All in Santa Ana, California.
Okay.
Santa Ana. And they had classification there and pre-flight at the same place. And when I was there, my Uncle Bill, my stepfather, died. He had retired at age 28, 30. He had so much overtime pay that time that counts as double time. So he didn't have to have been 30 years. But he stayed on in the civil service job on Governor's Island. And so we went back there, and I couldn't get a leave from the service to do that because he was not my biological father. So I appealed to the Red Cross, and the Red Cross made it happen. So I got back there too late for the funeral, but I was helpful in getting him settled, his wife settled down, Aunt Leona settled down in her apartment in New York, and then went back and got into primary training, primary flight school. And primary flight school was in Hemet, California, and we were flying PT-22s. And I've got a PT-22 flight here. I've got to show you that if I have it someplace. Oh. I'm going to show it to you later.
Well, can you describe it? Is it a monoplane, a biplane?
It's low wing, single engine, a fun plane, a sporty plane. Hemet, California is still there, and so is the Ryan aircraft manufacturing company still there. I visited there a couple of years ago.
Okay.
So we were halfway through the program, and because of my leave to go to the funeral, I was dropped back a couple of classes. I was in a G class of 44, and I dropped back a couple of classes. Halfway through the program, we found that the B-51s had been brought into work. We had a trouble in Europe when we were going all through this program, whether you were in basic training or pre-flight or wherever, we got information from the flight. They sent out a notice that was printed every day, and somebody would read it to us. Sometimes I read it, sometimes you would read it. And it kept us abreast of what was happening in the war zone. And we found out in the war zone that we were losing an awful lot of planes. In 1943, for example, we put up 387 planes and lost 60 out of 387. And 60 planes means there were 10 guys on the plane. That's a lot of trained, well-trained guys that were lost. And so they were trying to hurry up the training program, make sure that they were all ready, though, at all times. So as we were going through, they would tell us that the life expectancy was 34 seconds and stuff like that. And I don't know whether they're just trying to scare us out, see who's going to hold up. But nobody backed off of that. We stayed with it. And it didn't scare us off. What happened was that we had B-39, P-40s, and P-38s.
Yeah.
And the P-47s. They were the only air cover we had, but they couldn't get to target. They had limited the capacity, fuel for flight. So they had to take us through France, but before we got into Germany, then they were turning around going home, and the only thing to support the air flight, the mission, were the gunners on board. And so when the P-51 was introduced, it was beefed up so it could go all the way. And that made it turn around, and we got air supremacy. And even though there were 60,000 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulfs that were produced, we got air supremacy once we got the P-51s in there. They're good plane and good fighters. So they decided if we're going to have air supremacy, we don't need to have all these pilots we're training. So they cut back, didn't cut us all out, but they cut some of us out. And the only ones that were left in my group were guys who had been in the Pacific, what they call it, the Air Patrol, CAP.
Yeah, Civil Air Patrol.
Civil Air Patrol. And so I had my choice then of going to 3 different schools. I could go to armament school, engineer school, or radio school. And I said, well, this is the time for me to do what I should have done in the first place, to go join the 16th Infantry. So I put in a request to go to the 16th Infantry. By this time, the 16th had already done Africa, because I was still in high school when they did Africa, invaded in Africa. And all of the injured from there were brought back and went to Hahnemann Hospital in Staten Island. And so I went to visit all my buddies, because I became good friends within the 16th, and also the CCCs, which we had a group of CCC in Governor's Island. And when the war came, they were all sworn into the 16th Infantry. So that's how the war was going. We got the air supremacy, and I got cut back, and I said, well, I going to go to the 16th, and I put in an application, and it was denied. And it was denied because I was told that they had too much invested in me to turn me over to the infantry.
Because by then, how many months had you spent in the various stages of flight training, plus the college?
It was at least a year that I did that before I had to change. And that would have been in June of '44, because I didn't get in. My 18th birthday was May 30th, 1943. So I went on troop train on the very day I had a telegram to report.
Okay.
I'd already done all the preliminary work.
So they'd been training you for a year, and it was, flight training of different kinds. They were going to make you air crew whether you liked it or not.
Right.
Okay.
So I had these 3 schools. I said, well, this war is passing me by. This is my war. All my friends are in it. Damn it, I'm not going to miss it. If I can't get in the infantry, which is the quickest of these schools? So they told me 10 weeks for one and 8 weeks for the other. So the shortest one was 8 weeks with armament school. I went to 8 weeks in armament school, then another 8 weeks for gunnery school, and you can see the time is running out.
Mm-hmm.
So went from gunnery school in Kingman, Arizona. We were sent down to Plant Park in Florida, and that was a place where they make up the crews. And this was the first time they need a armor gunner and they need a tail gunner and so on. They bring together 10 cards and they say, okay, here's the crew. We got together for the first time and met and went off to OTU, training corps, overseas training operation, which in Drewfield in Florida. And we spent several weeks there getting to know each other, getting to know the B-17 inside and out,
Okay.
knowing how to fly it. We were flying that in Kingman. We were flying the B-17. And we were having fun because there were people grazing cattle, and they were dragging these targets, and rather than shoot at the target being dragged, we'd see if we could knock off some of that cattle. And we'd catch hell for doing it, but of course, all the farmers had to do, the cattle ranchers had to do, was report. They shot 3 more, Mike, and they got paid by the government, so they didn't have to go to market or anything, and they got to keep the meat.
Mm-hmm.
So
All right.
they weren't upset with that.
Okay. Now, before we go forward, I want to back up a little bit and talk about some of these training programs that you were in. So, while you were still doing the flight training, did you actually get to go and fly that trainer aircraft? So, had you done some flying?
The PT-22?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's what we did. We spent the entire time flying there. I had soloed by that time, and when they started to cut back, and they cut back 60% right off the bat. A week later, they cut another 20% back. So it was. By that time, I was in armament school in Denver, Colorado, in Lowry Field.
All right.
In Colorado.
And what do you actually learn in armament school?
Oh, in armament school, the only thing we used was 50 caliber machine guns, of course. So in armament school, it was a ritual of constantly dismantling 50 caliber machine guns and putting them back together again, because that would be my job. We had ground crews that took care of all of the guns and the turrets and everything on the ground. But if anything happened in flight, my job was to repair them in flight. Not only the machine gun, but also, which often got jammed and things, but also the turrets. And it was my job to get the turret gunner down into the turret, get him locked in, and to get him out if he got stuck. We couldn't land with the gunner in the turret. Mm-hmm. The other turrets were free. Tail gunner was hammered in there by the tail wheel, was lifted and it was pinned him in. You get around the tail all right. But then we had a top gunner who was also the crew chief. And he stood behind the pilot and the co-pilot. So that was my job in to answer your question, in armament school, was to constantly dismantle turrets, put them back together and machine guns, 50 caliber.
Okay.
We didn't get into the pistol firing until I think it was in pre-flight.
Okay.
That's when we were issued 45s, and the 45s we got carried in the shoulder holster, and every crew member had that. And we had a 490th bomb group that we got together every quarter, and we got magazine was put up, and it was a reunion, an annual reunion. And some of those people have written in the Bombs Away that only the pilot had a 45. They were shot down, and the pilot was the one who did negotiating because he was the only one with a gun. But when I got there, everybody had a 45.
All right. Now, what do you do then in gunnery school?
Gunnery school was all firing 50 calibers. Not all. Shouldn't say that. Because the 50 calibers were when we went up in the plane, but we did a lot of flying in a gunnery school where we were on a track, on an oval track, on the back of a pickup truck. We had a mounted shotgun, and we'd go around the track and they would shoot out birds, clay pigeons.
Mm-hmm.
And you'd have to swivel. It was on a swivel. You'd have to swivel and try and pick them up. And that was important because you're going this way and the pigeon is going the other way. Sometimes you're going straight up. And it was simulated what you would experience in flight against an enemy, coming in, coming and going. So that's all we did was shoot guns.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I talk funny, because I've lost my hearing in my both ears. At that time, they didn't have hearing protectors like they have today. But that was gunnery.
Okay.
Did that for 6-8 weeks.
All right, and then when you're in the air, and actually in the B-17, was there another plane that was towing some kind of target that you shot at?
Yes, yeah. It was just a streamer that they carried. And we fired at streamers. And they could count holes in the streamer and see if we were doing it. Instead of aiming at those cows down
Right. Okay. So you finish the gunnery school, and then the crew all gets together. You get into a B-17. You start training together.
there. Yeah. And that was at MacDill Field.
Mm-hmm.
And after we got to know each other and got to know our airplane, it was B-17G. New plane was delivered. We went and picked it up. We didn't use that plane at MacDill. We picked it up after MacDill, and we picked it up and we flew it around from. It was in Georgia that it was brought to us. A lot of women were ferrying planes in at that time, and we picked it up from a woman who flew it in, and then we went from there, stopped because when we left there we were on instructions to go to Europe, and when we left there we went to Bradley Field, I think it was, in Connecticut, and just spent a night there. Went from Bradley Field to Goose Bay, Labrador. Goose Bay, Labrador had snow piled high, shoulder high, and you could walk these paths that they had cut through. But the people there had fun because although it wasn't hilly, they had snowshoes and they could do a lot of fun with snowshoes, but we couldn't do any of that.
Right.
One thing, once we got assigned to overseas, we had sewn on our patch over our pocket, we had a blue field, and our wings were then pinned to the blue field. And the blue field said, no dangerous activities for these people. As a matter of fact, MPs honored it too. They couldn't pick you up because they didn't just take one guy out of service. They took a whole crew, 10 guys. If you were missing your ball-turret gunner, you weren't able to go anyplace. They did have pools overseas, so you could find one to borrow a ball-turret gunner if you had to. But basically, we were a unit. We had our own plane, and everything went overseas.
Okay.
When we got to Goose Bay, Labrador, we were having trouble with one of our engines. So we had to stay there for a while, change out an engine. We went from Goose Bay, Labrador to Iceland. Now this was a long trip. And I read something recently that said of all of the training in World War II, the greatest citation should be given to navigators. Navigators were taken out of civilian life, put in an airplane, and taught mapping and directions and everything, and took these hairy flights, like from Goose Bay, Labrador to Iceland, and found their way. It was, strangely enough, I've also seen a note that said we lost 1,000 airplanes from here to foreign service, just going to where we're going, whether it's going to the Pacific or going to the Europe. We lost 1,000 planes and crews. And I think that once in a while you read in a newspaper that in Greenland they have dug up airplanes. Well, this is obviously where somebody tried to land there, and the plane sunk down, the ice formed, and these planes were hundreds of feet down in the ice.
Mm-hmm.
But the deal was that we have to go to Greenland first. And we've got to circle Greenland because it's full of fjords.
Mm-hmm.
And in those fjords, submarines, German submarines, were lurking all the time, we were told.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to fly around Greenland to search the fjords and see if anybody's there.
Okay. So you get to Iceland.
We didn't stop in Greenland.
Right.
We just hit Greenland and turn right and go to Iceland. I hope Laura knows what he's doing because we were told you're not going to last 2 minutes in that water.
Mm-hmm.
You better get there. So we got to Iceland all right, but the engine wasn't working well, and we had to have the engine replaced again. So once more, we had to spend a couple of days there in Iceland. It was in the winter of '44, and in Iceland, the sun never sets completely in the winter.
It gets
You
close.
frown.
It gets close, but not well.
It gets close.
Well, isn't it really dark in the winter though? Because it's Iceland, so you're north. The days should be short.
Well, I know that it was dark because they suspected Germans to be infiltrating all that water, and they thought that they would come in and try to damage the ships that were parked there. So we had to take turns sleeping. I'm telling you, it was cold. I don't know if it was dark or light, but it was cold.
Yeah.
And we slept on board 2 at a time. Cy and I, Cy was our top gunner and our flight chief, our crew chief. And fortunately, we were carrying the only stuff other than the crew we carried was blankets that we were carrying for the infantry. And so we had plenty of blankets that we loaded up on when we were staying there. But I was surprised when we stayed in these little huts in Iceland, and little kids, we were in a place called Keflavik, not Reykjavik is the capital.
But Keflavik is a big air base, and we used that for a long time after the war, too.
Yeah. Well, we were at Keflavik, and we were all bundled up. We had all our flying stuff, and it was cold, so we would get out, see what was going on, and we'd walk down into Keflavik, and we'd find little kids down there, girls with little skirts, bare legs and everything. Say, how do these people do that? But we find out, what I didn't know then was that there's a lot of geysers and heat underground in Iceland that they work with. A lot of swimming there. We didn't get into any of that.
All right.
We couldn't because we had those blue patches.
Right.
Those damn blue patches.
Okay. So now where do you go from Iceland?
Valley Wales, that was our next stop. And that was a good flight too. But by this time, Lauren has proved himself. Lauren Davies, our navigator. I've got a picture here I'd like to show you of the crew.
Well, we've got a picture
before we
that's going to
leave.
go on the website along with
Right.
along with the rest of the interview. So okay.
Good.
Yeah.
Do you have a picture?
Yes, you gave me that.
Good. Okay. So we went to Valley Wales, and for the first time we get a hot bath. I don't know, it's a communal bath because water wasn't that plentiful, hot water. So I don't know if one guy got out and the next guy got in, but they had these big tubs of water. Nice hot bath. We got some good food. A lot of food in Iceland wasn't bad. We had staff there to take care of that. And we didn't spend too much time there because we were just getting reassigned. And we were reassigned there to the 490th Bomb Group. 490th Bomb Group was stationed at 134 was our station number. And it was in between two towns, Dis and I, but it was called the I terminal. And you could see if it came in, it was dark or cloudy. There was a big light at EY, so you knew where you were. Scattered all over where these farms had been converted. And one of the reasons that 490th didn't get there earlier than they did in 44 was because the station had to be built. And it was built by United States Corps Army engineers. And they had local people working them as well. But they had to lay down these tons of runway and blacktop for the parking areas. Had to get water systems and toilets and living quarters. We were living in Quonset huts, and the Quonset huts, our Quonset hut probably had 3, maybe 4. Couldn't have been 4. It was 3 because, and we were living in double-deck bunks, and our mattresses were made out of grain bags that were stuffed with hay. So we had 2 of those we called biscuits. 2 biscuits and a pillow.
Now, you said you were 3. There were 3 bomber crews in one Quonset hut. When you said you thought there were 3 and not 4, is that what you meant?
Yeah, I meant with 3 crews.
Yes.
3 crews. The Quonset hut had no insulation. You know, it was just a metal thing, and the only heating source that we had was a potbelly stove. And the potbelly stove, the only fuel we had was bomb rings. A bomb ring was the shipping container. There was no container that bombs were shipped in. They were shipped exposed, but it had 2 bomb rings made out of compressed paper, and they surrounded, and that kept them apart from the next one. They could stack these bombs without the bombs landing on one another. So we used bomb rings, but there were railroad cars going by with coal, and you could go out if you wanted to pick up coal along because it bounces off the car.
Okay.
Pick up coal, and you could feed that into the fire. But that's how the local population kept warm. So we didn't feel we should be taking them. They couldn't get bomb rings. We had bomb rings. So, but the bomb rings were kept burning all night. When you went to bed at night on your biscuits, we all had 45s and shoulder holsters. Some of us hung it on the bedpost. Some put it under the pillow, expecting anything to happen during the night. And only once in the time that I was there did I find one guy who was stressed out, I guess, woke up in the middle of the night and fired rounds through the roof. So
All right. Now,
he could have fired anywhere else, but he was.
Okay. Now, when did you actually arrive at that base?
It was in 45 April, I think.
Okay. So it's getting very late in the war by the time you get all the way over there.
Right.
All right.
Very late in the war. We may have been the last crew to arrive in theater.
Okay.
I'm not sure of that, but
Now, and then did you?
by that time, things were slowing down. There was not many flights. I got the impression that maybe some people were talking about surrender, or maybe they didn't have any targets. Maybe we'd leveled everything. But there weren't all everyday flights going on. We got very few. I think our total flying missions was fewer than 10
Okay.
in the time that we were there.
Now, do you remember the first mission that you flew?
Yes, a little bit. Primarily because there were three things happened to us that were done for efficiency. And we had, if you remember before the war, there were some experts, efficiency experts. They were working for Ford Motor Company. Robert McNamara was one of them. And these guys were pressed into service in Washington when the war started. We had nothing. We had no army. The 16th was very thin. And we didn't have any ships. We didn't have any planes. We had all that had to be built up. And they brought these guys in to mastermind how to do it. They did a spectacular job. In the end, though, their work was more in conservation, in conserving money, because they must have been pouring money into this war in great quantities. So the first thing they did was eliminate a waist gunner. There are two waist guns. I was the left waist gunner, right waist gun. They eliminated the waist gunner, said the radio man comes out of the radio room and he can take the right gun because we've got radio silence over target anyway. But we didn't have the Messerschmitts and the Focke-Wulfs, they were pretty decimated by this time. We saw a few of those. But we did have flak, and that was the main defense for Germany. You could walk on it, it was that heavy. So somebody had decided the way to handle the flak was to use chaff. C-H-A-F-F, I think it's spelled. They cut a port in the radio room, and we had boxes of chaff, and the radio operator, when we were over any aircraft field, was feeding this stuff, this chaff, which is like Christmas tree tinsel, feeding that out through the port. The purpose, of course, was, I think they had radar at that time that they were using, and that it would distract the radar, and their anti-aircraft guns would be aimed at the shaft floating down and not at us. Consequently, the right gun was not handled by the radio man as suspected. So I said, that's all right. The left radio gunner can swivel and get them coming in and get them going out at the same time. So that was one efficiency. The second efficiency that they saved money with was to stop pinpoint bombing. They went to pattern bombing, which was sometimes called blanket bombing. And I'm sure economy is the only purpose because he had been trained. Jim McMahon was our bombardier, and he had been trained well. I'm sure they didn't send him home. They made him a lead bombardier. And the idea was that each plane then would have a toggleier. And I was the armorer, so I was made toggleier. But I was in the waist, and the bomb release was up in the nose. So for practice, it wasn't practical to do that. And the navigator's already up there, and the top gunner is already up there. He can do that. So that was, what happened was that the lead bombardier had trailing lights, and when the green light came on, you get ready, and when the red light came on, you let open a bomb bay, and the red light, you drop your bombs.
Okay, and so the toggleier just pulls a switch or something, and that lets the bombs go?
Yeah, it was all toggled, and they could do that up from the nose. Bombardier did that. Because remember, the bombardier took control of the airplane on the bomb run. Just before you get into the bomb run, he takes control. He can move the plane back and forth and really fly it. And the pilot just sat back and let him have it until the bombs were dropped, and then he got the plane back, got us out of there. So that was the second economy that was performed. And see, what was the third one? There was three of them. At any rate, we had a squadron. I was with the 851st, our crew was. And we had a lead plane, and so Jim became lead bombardier, and we flew two planes on either side and one in the back. You get that prop wash, so you're always fighting it. So they flew at different altitudes. This was called, if I remember right, it was called vertical box formation. And it was designed by General Curtis LeMay. And it was designed to give formidable, when you go all the way out with that, and you've got our squadron, you got another squadron, behind us the same thing. It made it impenetrable. So a fighter wouldn't know. They were looking for people who were straggling, you know, like a hunter does, a lion looking for a deer, wait for one to get loose.
Because as long as you stay in formation, you have a field of fire around the whole formation.
Right. And the rule was, which I never saw happen, but the rule was every plane had to be within 50 feet of each other. And you're always fighting to do that, and you'd see them drifting apart. I had a picture at home of a mission with the planes, and they were really spread out. Ours was pretty tight, but the funny part about that first mission was that it was the first time I had seen a German jet plane. And I have read in Bombs Away that other people had reported seeing them as early as January. But I thought, nobody told us about it anyway. So I thought that we were one of the first to see it. It was late in the war, and they were deep in the Black Forest. They were building these things. It was a Focke-Wulf 282, I think.
Messerschmitt 262, but yeah.
252.
262, yeah. Anyway.
And we had never trained for that. We have on our top of our on our gun, we've got a gun sight. We had a single barrel gun at the waist and an iron gun sight. It's a 3-rad system. And in gunnery school, we spent days, long days, in a blackened room where they would flash an airplane or flash a battleship or some sort of a sea ship. And you had to identify it. And you didn't get out of that school until you could identify those things. But you had to identify not only the plane, because then in your memory you had to have stored the wingspan and the airspeed of that plane. And knowing those things, you could then sight through the 3-rad system. The peep sight was single, but the 3-rad system, you could move around and give leads to the plane. And you had to calculate whether the plane was coming directly in or whether it was coming this way. And then me, on the waist gun, had to come from here and back there. Well, we didn't have to do that because we didn't have to know how to shoot at these planes anyway. They were going too fast for anything we'd studied. And the third thing that I had forgotten was the economy, was that they had every 5th round, we had tracer bullets. So if you lost a plane through the sighting system, you could watch where your guns were going to coordinate with your sights. And with the jet plane, if we had the tracer in there, we could at least take a shot at them and see where it's going, in spite of not being trained to do it. But the tracers had been removed by the efficiency experts. They're more expensive, I think, than the others. So there were the 3 things that affected us on that flight. Other than that, it was a peaceful flight. We had some holes from the flak, but nothing serious. And the P-51 were everywhere, covering us. So we felt pretty secure. Not a bad flight at all. But after the war, it was ended, and it ended in June.
May, but
in May. Then everybody who had accumulated a great number of missions went first. They went by number of crew flights you had, and they were sent home first. And we stayed. We were one of the new crews, so we stayed and we did after war.
Okay. Now, before we get into that, let's go back to you say you fly maybe what 6, 8 missions, something like that during the war. Where did you fly to?
Always into Germany, deep into Germany. The early people, I remember the first flight had a long name that I can't remember. But the earlier flights were into France too, because we had targets in France as well. Even late in the war, Germany had aircraft battalions along the French coast of because they knew that's where the airplanes were coming.
Well, they still had some fortresses along the coast that were still holding out.
Yes.
So they were isolated, but they were still there.
Well, of course, we saw that when we invaded France, when we went into Normandy.
Yeah. Okay.
They had machine gun nests well implanted, concrete.
Right. But anyway, some of those defenses were still there even in 1945 and only surrender at the end of the war.
Right.
And they're in parts of the Netherlands too and that kind of Okay. But you're flying over Germany. Did you fly to Berlin?
No, don't think we ever did.
Do you remember what the longest mission was, or how, in terms of distance?
No, it was that was the longest one. The one I can't remember the name of it, but no, I can't answer that.
Okay, that's fine. Long time ago.
The flight, we flew everything at 25,000 feet, and I wanted to wind this up about the German jets because they could only stay up there for one pass. And I don't know what the problem was, but they had to go back for servicing at that point. And our P-51s couldn't fight them. But since they couldn't stay up long enough, the P-51s would lay back and wait for them to go back for servicing. And then we took them out on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how the Germans were feeling about that, but
That's how we got
you
along.
get them wherever you can get them.
Sure. Now, did any of the planes in your squadron get shot down while you were on
No.
missions with them?
No,
Okay.
no, not when I was with them. And we had the 848, the 49th, 50th, 51st, and we flew at the squadron. And that was the 490th was
Right.
that squadron. And behind us was the 100th. They always flew behind us.
Okay. And then did anybody in your air crew ever get hurt or anything like that?
Never.
Many of the Flaxos?
Never.
So relatively safe considering what you were doing.
Relatively safe, in spite of the fact that they had a jet plane.
Right.
We were relatively safe.
Okay. So now the war ends, but you're still there. And what kind of missions do you fly? What are you doing after the German surrender?
But after the war, the most important thing that our government had to do was to get political prisoners back out of the war zone. They had been captured and held for years and starving. And we flew in to Orly Field, where they had all been brought in, and brought them back to England. Some of them were pretty important people that were captured. We had, by regulation, we had to disinfect them before we let them into our airplanes. And we did that with flit guns. And we used a flit gun all over these important people, as though they hadn't been insulted enough in this war. We had to make sure that they weren't bringing any bugs back to England.
So a flick gun's like a handheld sprayer like you'd have used for bug spray or something?
In those days, before your time, I'm sure, Jim,
yeah.
it was called a flit gun. And it had a tank with a nozzle and a cylinder that you pushed on this, and you could get flies in the air and everything. But that's what they used for flit guns. And it was DDT is what they were spraying them with. And there were several flights like that to get those people out. And what they happened to them when they got back, I don't know. We just unloaded them, and they were taken off someplace. On one of the flights, our tail gunner had some kind of a fit, and he was never flew again after that. So we treated him the best we could, but it made me think when that happened that all of those flights before us, where there was a lot of injuries in the planes, that you didn't have a doctor, you didn't have a nurse on board, and there were none of us on the crew were ever trained in first aid. So if anybody got shot, you did the best you could, but it was hours before you're going to be able to get back.
Right.
You know, in the infantry, at least if you got shot, there was a corpsman there, and they would drag you back if they had to and get you to some unit as fast as possible. But in the Air Force, in the bombers, you were there, you were stuck there.
Right.
And a lot of people died because they didn't get back in time. They bled to death.
Okay.
But there wasn't any bleeding, but Tommy did have this epileptic kind of seizure.
Yeah. All right. Now, what was life like in England when you were not flying? What did you do?
There was always a card game going on in the Quonset hut, a poker game. And there was a movie that we saw that with Mickey Rooney, where Mickey Rooney had won big in the crap games in his company. He was in the Army. And he was going to go home and a millionaire. And he had stuffed money in all of his, down his pants and in his shirt.
Yeah.
And his
Don't
company,
play with your microphone. That'll make noise.
No.
Thank you.
His company was in combat, and he got shot and the money was flying all over the place. That's why there were a lot of guys who said, by God, I'm going to be Mickey Rooney, I'm going to go home, a lot of money. And so everything they had, they were playing poker. So other than that, there was, we didn't have much time other than that. The people who were stationed there permanently, after all, when an airplane took off from the base, we had all these ground people, had nothing to do until we came back. And when we came back, they were all gathered around, and there were stationary administrative people too, people who plotted the flights and all of that. And they had all day without any of us there. They had softball games, and they had dates. They went into town and had some beer and did the usual things you would find.
Now, could you do that at least occasionally? I mean, if the weather was bad or there wasn't a mission that day?
Yeah, sometimes. Once we went into London, and we stayed at, I think it was the Red Cross Club was in London. And we did all the sites there, which I went back and visited later. But that's about all we had time for, because we were busy flying these other flights while everybody else was getting out. We were closing down the 490th Bomb Group. And when it was closed down, incidentally, it was the end of the 490th, because we were given a 90-day leave when we went home after overseas training. We went home for 90 days. During the 90-day period that I was home, Japan received 2 atom bombs, and the war was over. So we had orders were telegraphed to us what to do then. We were, after our 90 days leave, I went back to Florida, went back to MacDill Field to get discharged. And when I was at MacDill Field, once again, we're waiting for people with more points than I had. But over at Drew Field, I had a football team, 3rd Air Force Gremlins. And I played sandlot at Governor's Island. I couldn't play with the high school football team because my high school is on double shift. Some people went in the morning till 1, some people went to 1 to 5. Consequently, football practice was at 6 o'clock at night. Well, so much for that.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to wait from 1 o'clock until 6 o'clock to play. So anyway, I went over, and the guy was the coach. I think his name was Rabbit Smith. He was coach of Tennessee. And talked my way on. I was a running guard. I was 170 pounds, running guard. So he said, okay, I'll give you a suit. So he had me playing on defense when he ran his team. And standing over me were 2 All-Americans. Cass Mislinski from West Point, from Army. He was All-American. And Bob Merritt was tackle. He was All-American from Washington State. And we had one other All-American on the team, Charlie Trippi from Georgia. So these guys were, as you would expect, pretty good players. And we each got 2 tickets. We each got tickets for the 50-yard line for the games. First game we're going to play against the 1st Air Force at Mitchell Field. And that was why I did it. I wanted to get back home to New York. So before the first game, we're playing all of this scrimmage, 2 practices a day in Florida in the summertime with pads. So I went down to 160 pounds. And these big giants were making mincemeat out of me. So it didn't bother me. Just let me make that first. So we got to the airplane to go on our first the first game at Mitchell Field, and the coach threw me his keys and said, "Jerry, take my my car back, will you?" And that was the end of my football career with the 3rd Air Force Gremlin. The tickets we got, you didn't have to use them; you could cash them in. So my 2 tickets were $5 a piece. I could get $10 a week during football season. But these All-Americans were getting 10 or 20 tickets.
Mm-hmm.
So they weren't really getting paid,
Yep.
but they were getting these tickets they cashed in right away, $5. So Charlie Tripp was getting $100 a week playing football.
Gee, that's pretty.
Well, I
good
wasn't
scam.
surprised because when I went in Jefferson Barracks in basic training, I took that troop train out of Manhattan, went to Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, and I sat up in a coach with a nice guy. I learned his name was Jack Graham. When we got to Jefferson Barracks, it was nighttime and dark, and we were lined up getting our blankets so we get some night's sleep. And somebody came along and said, Jack Graham, and he said, yeah, here. The guy came over and said, you Jack Graham with first base with Brooklyn Dodgers? And he said, yeah. He said, would you come with me, please? We never saw Jack Graham again in basic training.
All right.
The next day I went to a physical training, PT, and the guy giving the leader in PT, Vic Rashi, one of the great golfers of those days. Vic Getty was
Okay.
the guy. Vic Rashi was a pitcher for the New York Yankees. He was on it too. Anyhow,
Okay.
that's
So that
my
wa-
story of
okay.
World War II.
So that was going back to the beginning, just a piece of the early part of the story
Yeah.
that we were adding. Okay. So when do you actually get discharged?
I got discharged
Discharged.
in 1945 in December. I was in my barracks and they were closing down discharges, and the guy came in and I was listening to Lum and Abner or something on the radio at night, and he said, you've got a chance here if you want to get discharged for Christmas. You can do it today. It's the last day.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, we're going to be closed until after the first of the year. And I went down to get discharged, and they said, we'll give you discharge if you want to, but we want to offer you increase in rank if you'd re-enlist and occupy Germany. And so they wanted to make me a tech sergeant
Mm-hmm.
if I'd sign up again. And if it wasn't Christmas, I would have considered it. But it was Christmas, and I took the opportunity to take my discharge.
Mm-hmm.
They gave me my money, $200 or something, discharge money, and I hitchhiked back to New York.
All right.
And when I got back to New York, Governor's Island was the only home I knew.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Governor's Island, new commanding officer, Colonel George S. Burkett, very handsome man. He had no soldiers. They all were off to war. He was commanding officer of this flank fort.
Okay.
However, they had given him all of the Italian war prisoners had been concentrated there.
Mm-hmm.
So he had to figure what to do with them, and he put them to work. They grew their own food out on the end of Governor's Island. They worked making furniture, some of which I have in my home today. Good furniture. Some of them were cooked before they got into the Italian army. They were there during the whole war, and all of them, none of them escaped. None of them tried to escape.
Probably didn't want to. Yeah.
None of them wanted to escape. As a matter of fact, there were a number of them migrated back after the war. They wanted to live in America
Right.
that they were imprisoned in.
Okay. Now, was your mother living somewhere else by this time, or was she still?
Yes.
Okay.
My mother was living over in Brooklyn, but the Colonel Burkett had a beautiful daughter who I met and married. Her name was George Ann.
Mm-hmm.
And she and I lived for 66 years together as husband and wife. She died 2 years ago, and we were in South Carolina then. And she's buried up in Pennsylvania, in her hometown.
Mm-hmm.
Colonel Burkett and Mrs. Burkett, both of them, Honesdale, Pennsylvania. And so I buried her up there, and the stone is already cut, and my
We're all
name
waiting
is
for
already
you.
on it, and my Air Force medallion is down in the bottom corner.
To back up a little bit again, Colonel Burkett had kind of an interesting history too, didn't he?
Yes.
Was a West Pointer?
He was West Point, class of 17. And the bright ones, they sent off further college, and he was sent to Yale. And he got electrical engineering degree. And he went back to West Point as an instructor. And he taught English as well as electrical engineering. At that time, Douglas MacArthur was superintendent there. And Mrs. Burkett, George Ann's mother, told me that the women of the post, officers' wives, hated Douglas MacArthur because he insisted that they could never leave the house without white gloves. They never were accustomed to that, but he was a stickler.
All right. Now, he also knew Dwight Eisenhower, right?
Yes, Dwight was in West Point at the same time. They were both spent most of their time, neither of them ever commanding troops. They both spent all of their time in intelligence. They went to South America, places in embassies, but they got together again in the giant maneuvers that we held in Louisiana in 1939. As a matter of fact, Colonel Burkett was a major then. Major Burkett was head of intelligence for the Red Army, and Major Eisenhower head of intelligence for the Blue Army. And after the maneuvers were over, the Blue Army captured the Red Army, and Major Eisenhower became Colonel Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, and led the invasion in Europe.
Right.
And Colonel Burkett went back to administration, became commanding officer at posts like Governor's Island, and did all that brain work.
Okay.
And he retired, incidentally, and George Ann and I were guests in the receiving stands, in the reviewing stand. And he retired as regimental commander of field artillery at Fort Dix. Went over in Pennsylvania and bought a lovely farm, and our 4 children, and George Ann spent their summers at the farm in Pennsylvania with him. Lovely people.
Okay. Now, yourself, you got married, but did you also go to college or just go to work, or what did you do?
Yep. I did 3 jobs at one time because having children, and I had not finished high school when I enlisted. I had to go back, finish high school. I said, with my experience in the Army, I won't have to do that. So I went to NYU and to other colleges, and they said, no, nothing doing. We've got all these graduates coming in here from high school, getting out of the Army, want to fill up. We have no seat for somebody who hadn't finished high school. So I had to go back to high school. I was married, had children, went back to high school, and all these squirts in Erasmus Hall in Brooklyn. And so I dropped out of there and I went to high school at night, Erasmus Hall. Got my high school. Couldn't get into college without your grade point average. What they call it, GP or something.
GPA, yeah.
No, it was something else that you need in New York State.
Well, there's like the Regents exam or something you take.
Regents.
Yeah.
You need Regents. And as you know, in New York, or you may not know, in the New York and Regents, you have to have 2 years of science or language, and 4 years of English, and 3 years of math in New York State. So I had to pile all that in before I could get into college. I went to college in New York, up in the not the Empire State Building, but second tallest building was the Woolworth Building, and there was a college up there that I went to. But by this time, I found out that numbers was my game, and I was going to be in numbers somewhere, and probably in accounting. And so I went to Pace College, and before I got there was Pace Institute. There were just a couple of brothers, the Pace brothers, who got together and started this institute, which became a college. then it became a university.
Right.
Where it is today. It takes all up Park Row, downtown Manhattan. Now it's university. And they give law degrees and everything else. At my time, it was strictly, although we studied law, it was mostly business law. All the rest of it was accounting.
Right.
So I finished there and went to work for American Brake Shoe Company as an industrial engineer apprentice. So for 3 years, I trained as an industrial engineer, and I never went back to accounting. And I went from there to Avon Products in Suffern, New York, that I was the manager of the industrial engineering department. This is for an accountant.
Right.
I was trained industrial engineer. Avon products were growing so quickly that every few months I got promoted into something else, and eventually brought into New York office to correct a problem that they had with packaging. That all of these beautiful packages that were designed and produced and filled in the manufacturing departments were bulk packed in boxes sent to distributors, to representatives.
Right. The Avon ladies.
The
Yes.
Avon lady. And Avon ladies sometimes had good facilities delivering them. Sometimes they weren't. Most of them were getting, all these pretty things were broken up, cartons were crushed, and so the executive VP, Norman Chadwick, he called me and he's, Jerry, the problem we've got here is that these people are not getting it the way we intended they should get it. And we want you to do something about that. Take a year. We don't care what you do, what money you spend. Find out what's happening and fix it. So I became the first packaging engineer in the world. So I just trained myself. I went to different schools and took different courses. I traveled. I spent time with the distributors and representatives when they opened their packages to see exactly how. Then I went with manufacturers and found out how that we could beef up certain things and what we needed. And so I became the chief packaging engineer for Avon Products, which soon developed into a 10-man crew. And by that time, I had left there, and I went to work as director of packaging for Elizabeth Arden, and came out to Michigan to head up a little company was starting out here that recruited me to come out here to help them in their packaging effort. It was called Amway, which is a big company now. But that time it was just a small company. Matter of fact, I had a parking space right in front of my office.
There you go. Now, to look back at things, how do you think your time in the service affected you? What did you learn from that, or what did you take out of that?
I would say that once I got out of the Army, the curtain was drawn, and never looked back on any of it. I look back on it to this extent. I was given at one time in my career, my Army career, I was given a choice of armament, engineering, and radio man. And I took the one because it was the shortest. I didn't want to miss the war. But after the war, there's no use for an armament. Who needs a guy who can dismantle machine guns? Any of the other two, you could have gotten a job with. And I didn't have any of those skills. So I was starting from scratch. Other than that, bad decision. I can't say I used any of it. Esprit de corps, yeah, use that all the while. That's a very important part of the Army. Our crew would stick together through thick and thin. We communicated together throughout our lives. Last year, the navigator, Lauren Davies, died, and he left me, the sole survivor now of the crew. But we communicated and called each other, worried about, attended weddings, things like that.
All right.
It was a tight crew. But as far as reunions go, every year we had a reunion. I attended a couple of them. The rest of the crew didn't. Air crews had very little in common with the rest of the base.
Mm-hmm.
The people who went over there in 1944 in the late winter had been together at Mountain Home, Idaho, where the 490th was formed.
Mm-hmm.
And they had trained together. They shipped on by sea ship to England together. They were all buddies. And they served from 44 to 45
Mm-hmm.
and came home and were discharged.
Right.
They had reason for
Sure.
reunion.
Yeah. Well, they
We
had
didn't
the
have.
they had the band of brothers experience, but your brothers were really just the guys in your own air crew.
Just the guy in the air crew.
All right.
Even the guys in your Quonset hut.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one had finished up their tours. In the beginning, remember that there were 25 tours with the criteria.
Yeah. You had
for
25
rotating.
missions. Yeah.
And then it moved up to 35. When I got there, it was 50. So we had a long way to go
Yeah.
before we got there. But it was, we had air supremacy,
Right.
and it was natural to increase to 50. So that meant you kept more there, you had to produce more back in the States.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, it's a remarkable story, so I'd just like to thank you for coming in here and sharing it with me
I
today.
enjoyed telling it to you again, Jim.
All right.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.